Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the September 2001. Still remote, still not getting together in person, but um, in spirit. We're all together in spirit. Today,
You
we
said
have
2001.
2021. Oh, my goodness. Thank you. Thank you, John. I can count on you. Yes, 2021. Wow. And today we have Chris Irvine. Chris Irvine is, I'm sorry? Oh, somebody's mic is on. Oh, Vince Manano's here. Hey, Vince.
Hi there.
Hi, we're just getting started here. Chris Irvine is speaking. He's from Three Prong. He has a history in computer science. Had various management roles in multiple industries, development and database work, and landed on Claris FileMaker or FileMaker. So he's been doing FileMaker specific stuff for the last 15 years. And today he was going to talk to us about his 3-tier FileMaker approach and transactions. So rather than me to drone on about that, we'll let Chris go ahead.
All right. Jonathan, what's your preferred sort of duration for presentation and QA and stuff? How's your timeline usually work for these meetings?
We allow 2 hours. You're laughing. So if you want to take 45 minutes or an hour, that would be great.
Okay.
So
Okay.
let me set you up to be able to share your screen here. There we go. All right, you're it.
All right. Well, if I go on for 2 hours, definitely, stop me at some point. But I do hope that we, depending on how this all works.
Excuse me 1 second, Chris. A question's been asked in the chat, and I think it would be good for you to choose. Would you like questions along the way, or would you like us to hold the questions to the end?
I think I'd like questions along the way.
Okay.
Actually.
Very good.
Yeah. For me, the perfect presentation is one that I don't get to the end of because we got distracted with some great questions and ended on a tangent or something.
Oh, okay.
So,
You'll fit right in here.
okay. Great. All right. Well, some introduction was already done, so I'll be able to skip some of that. That'll be great. I was trying to think of something clever or punny to do with my title, and I was thinking about the hello marketing that Apple did, which is now back in Big Sur. There's a screensaver and stuff. So transactions say hello to tiers. So it's that's how we're going to do that. A little bit was already said about me. I'm connecting from Oregon, and so it's a good morning still. It's been quite wet here the last week, which is actually great because that is a good way to wrap up wildfire season. I just assume have things be doused and put out, and we can have some rain for a few days here. So it's pretty wet at the moment. In July, I was able to give a presentation to a couple meetups actually in your area, and we talked about architecture more broadly. And so this presentation, I'm actually kind of continuing on that topic a little bit, going and showing the connection how transactions can fit into a multi-tier architecture. But if you want to dig up or contact me offline for the recording of that meeting, some of these topics we talked about more in depth. But I'm just going to cruise over them for anyone that wasn't participating there to give you just a little bit of background of some of the stuff that I'm going to be building on. So we presented some of these different concepts. So separation of concerns is really when we concentrate on small tasks one at a time, and in practice in FileMaker solutions, that often looks like converting a solution for some problem into multiple small scripts instead of one giant monolithic script, kind of trying to break down the problem into simpler parts. This idea of coupling is how well things are sort of loose modules that can be plugged together, or are they very sort of brittle and only work in a limited way. And so another good analogy I can think of in FileMaker would be like the transition that some of us have been making from popovers to card windows. Popovers are tied to the layout that we put the popover on and the context of that layout. But if we can rebuild those sort of modal behaviors in a card window, then we can decouple from that parent window, and it gives us an opportunity to make interfaces and little pickers and modules and things that are reusable in multiple places in our solution. So that would be a great example of sort of a loosely coupled approach to solving modal input or something like that. Defensive programming is just all about preparing for the unexpected. And so that could be your own bugs that you want to guard against, but also if you're working on a team with other developers, bugs from other developers, or the worst bugs that are me 6 months ago developer. That's the one I'm usually most angry at. But also users do things that we don't expect. They seem to go rogue sometimes, which is actually sometimes good, but not what we expected. And but then also just malicious users, those things can all be defended against. And then one of the other things we talked about was just capitalizing on the strength of our platform. So there's some things that FileMaker does really well, other things that are weak points or sore spots, but definitely understanding what those strengths are and making the most of those, trying to take advantage of things that FileMaker does really well. Some of the things that come to mind is just how amazing it is that we can refactor and rename and rapidly change a solution to fit the changing business requirements of our users. That's something that FileMaker does extremely well. Perform script on server is actually quite an incredible capability that can be leveraged to our advantage. And the way that FileMaker works with UUIDs has also turned out to be pretty good strength, in my opinion, too. So those are all things that I try to use as much of as I can, and there are other things too, but kind of thinking about things that FileMaker does well and then leveraging those whenever we can. And then the last one on the list here is about multi-tier architecture. And I'm going to make a little bit of an argument that the separation model that a lot of you might be familiar with is not really, the intent there wasn't multi-tier architecture. And so I'm going to talk about why I think those are different, kind of contrast those a little bit. So we'll go a little bit more in depth on that. All right. So let's look at that next. So if we start out with a single file solution, this is what we call it when everything's all in one FileMaker file, right? We've got our interface, our automation, database storage, all the entire application stack in a single file, basically. And that can work well for simple and small projects, but there are some limitations with having everything in one pot. And so as the system starts to mature and grow, have more users connected, then we start thinking about other ways to approach things. So the separation model really separates out data that belongs with the user from the rest of the solution. And so some of those things we push down into a data file, and then other items we keep in a solution file. And at least with the background that I understand of the separation model, the real advantage here of doing it this way was to help with having a development and production environments where you could send a solution into production, and users could start creating records and modifying data. And then you could work on new features and test those in a development environment. And then you could push forward your solution file from development to production without overwriting the user's data. And without this sort of model, then you would be forced to do a lot of exporting and importing of data, things like that. That could become quite a hardship if as they have more and more data in the production system. It becomes more burdensome to export and import everything. I would suggest at this point, if you're using the separation model for this reason, if you haven't already, it would be worth joining the FDS and taking a look at the data migration tool. Because that provides another option for doing a bulk move of data in and out of your development and production systems that might work as well, or maybe even better than using the separation model. So it'd definitely be worth at least exploring. So how's that different from a multi-tier or three-tier architecture? So when most multi-tier solutions, shouldn't say most. I don't know if I'm an expert on that, but there could be any number of tiers, but it's very common to see them described in a three-tier approach, where we make these logical separations of what part of the solution involves presentation, what part of our solution involves logic, and then the data tier. So it's sort of a conceptual barriers between the three tiers. And there are other software architecture models too, like model view controller, or MVVM, or trying to think of some other ones. And each of those different architectures have different strategies that try to address certain challenges in system design. Some of those strategies work really well in certain environments more than other environments. Like a model view controller, I think actually has a lot of advantages in certain environments, but a lot of it is sort of related to object-oriented programming, which we don't really have in FileMaker. So I think the tiered model actually works really well with the tools and capabilities of our platform. I think it's a pretty good fit. So if we are to implement three tiers in 3 files, then those files are going to actually show up on our server when we're hosting them. And the naming convention that I've been using for this, that came from a team I was working with, that I've got to give credit to Perrin and Mark, contributed a lot on coming up with some of these things. We would have a code name for our project, in this case Donner, and that's really the only file, that's the entry point that users would see. And then the other 2 files would be hidden. The Wingman file is where we would handle our logic implementation, and then the table storage file for the data tier. And you can kind of see how these things were broken out. The one thing that I want to touch just a little bit on is this idea of reports. And this is actually an area that I'm still kind of, I feel like I'm refining, and maybe it's not quite right yet, but a lot of our reports are user driven. User clicks a button to see an invoice that then they print or email or something like that. But then we also will often build reports that are automated, like a end of month batch processing or something like that. And those reports might be sent out at 2 in the morning. by a server schedule or something. And so those wouldn't really belong in the presentation tier. Those would belong in the logic tier because they're not being presented to a FileMaker end user. So, so part of the idea with a multi-tier architecture like this is whenever you're going to solve a problem or address a problem, thinking through what you need to do and, you know, are the things that I need to implement, do they belong in the presentation tier or do they belong in the logic tier? Or maybe I could cut that problem, maybe it spans both. And so I need to sort of create a barrier between the user interface components and the logic components and split up the problem. So I also want to kind of break the idea of it being 3 files. So when you have a multi-tier approach, you could add more presentation files into your presentation tier. So this might be you decide to launch a FileMaker Go front end for your solution. So in something like this, the mobile interface would not have any sort of dependency on the back office or desktop interface, but they would share a common logic layer. So then we might be looking at 4 files in our solution architecture. There's also the opportunity to split up your data if you have a larger solution and you need to spread out the data on multiple files. That's an option. It becomes a lot more practical if you're using external authentication or something like that, so you're not having to manually or automate synchronizing accounts between your data files. We might also add entry points into the logic layer directly. That could be like if you want an external website to call into your solution, the website wouldn't really ever talk to the presentation tier. It would just be talking to your logic tier. And so sometimes we'll make a file that's actually kind of like the firewall or proxy of those requests coming in from an external system. Then they could be pre-processed or validated here before they actually start to hit our business automation. And server schedules are not really a file, but it's worth pointing out that if we're going to schedule some activity and there's no end user involved, the schedule entry on the server would point to a script directly in the logic tier. It would never talk to a user interface script because there is no user to provide inputs or feedbacks, things like that. And this can provide some benefits as far as reliability because you don't have things like script triggers or you know, a sequence of windows or events that are maybe happening in your user interface that wouldn't be appropriate for a scheduled script. But there's also sometimes performance advantages, especially if you have a legacy user interface with a lot of overhead. Just opening that file can be take a while, and so if you can skip that process and just jump right into the logic tier, there can be some performance advantages. And then the last thing I was going to mention is that sometimes we'll even have modules that we throw onto our system. So I'll make a pitch for on the Scale FM website, there's a free module called Sequence Generator for assigning like customer numbers and invoice numbers, things like that. And it's sort of a freestanding module that you can just drop the FileMaker file on your server and then call scripts in it. And it's sort of a self-contained product, but you could think of it sort of living in the logic and data tier because it has scripts that you can call and it also has some persistent data. So there's not a hard line with files having to be in a certain tier. It's more about a logical intent of sort of separating things out into these tiers. So I already touched on some of the advantages. For sake of time, I'm not going to go into all of these, but I think there's quite a few things that you potentially gain by breaking things up into these layers. I'm going to check to see if I'm behind on any questions that were posted. Okay. Looks like we're doing all right. So this idea of an atomic transaction, this is a computer science term, especially in the realm of databases. That's all about making changes to your records or tables in such a way that a group of things that all belong together are all performed together. And we put a sort of boundary around that transaction and sort of say it's all or nothing. And so generally you're trying to reduce all the changes down to just the most critical set. And so often that's defined as indivisible and irreducible. So an example of this that I was thinking of was like when I open up my phone and I want to make my mortgage payment and I go to my online banking thing and I say use my checking account and send money into my, make my mortgage payment, hit apply, and then if the battery on my phone dies or my cell connection drops or something like that, I'm trusting that the bank is not going to break down my request for making a payment into 10 steps and then stop halfway through. I don't want the money deducted from my checking account and then not making it as a mortgage payment. I want to know that the entire transaction happens atomically. Either the whole payment was made and the money's not in my checking account anymore, or it failed and the money is at least still in my checking account so I can try again later. And then one of the key other things about this is that an atomic transaction can't be observed by anyone else until you've finished it. So if you are in the middle of a transaction and there's another user on your system, they can't see that thing that's in progress. It doesn't exist to them until you commit. The changes are actually all saved out. So I'm going to try to demonstrate this with a real solution and some demo files, of which I'll post all these afterwards. I'm happy to let people pry things open and critique and borrow whatever is most useful for you. And so I'm going to kind of have three different demos. The first one is going to just be without any scripts involved, just how we interact with layouts already. And then the second one is going to be with some script involvement where we're going to supervise the types of edits that a user can make through our layout. And then the third one is going to be without any user interface at all. So a pure logic layer transaction. And they're all kind of work slightly differently, but they're based on a lot of the same concepts. All right, so I'm going to jump up to my demo file and we'll see if everything works as planned. All right, so I am hosting this Donner solution on a local server here. And so it's definitely hosted, so we can see how record locks behave when there's multiple users connected and things like that. And I have 2 of my 3 files open already because I needed, I opened the user interface first, and because I was starting to look at record data, that triggered my table storage had to be open. And there's nothing in here. Let me get rid of these layouts. This is how you know it's a live demo, because they're changing the demo as we go. The data storage file in my demo file here, I have a customer entity. So this is really a customer table that I decided was starting to have too many fields in it, so I broke it up into multiple tables. So there's still one record for each customer. And each time that there's a customer, they may also have an aux or stats record. did the same thing with my orders. I took my order table and for various reasons, decided to kind of split it up into three records. So this is horizontal partitioning is what we call it when we take a simple entity like an order and we decide to break it up into multiple tables across. And then I have an order item table and some accounts tables. So this is my data storage file, and in here there are no scripts. There are no layouts except for this one that points at empty. So that's how my table storage file sort of stays. And then in my user interface layer, I start adding relationships to that connect to my data layer. So here's my order entity, and then I have some relationships to customer records and line items on my orders. And so those are pretty normal. This is a little bit of a break from the anchor buoy model because these are one-to-one horizontal partitions of the order. I kind of like storing them in a stack right with the primary entity that they're with. So this is sometimes I'll even do this, really kind of squeeze them in there. So they're just part of the sandwich of orders, the order entity. And that's what we're looking at on this layout here. We'll just explore this a little bit. So I have a place here to enter order information. So I've got my automatically assigned order number, customer PO number. This customer wants me to ship this order by October 14th. And I've got some items that they've ordered here. And if we start interacting with this data, we can see some things happen. So I'm going to use the FileMaker function get record open count, which shows us how many records we have locked, tied up on the server that we're currently editing. So when we click around in here, nothing gets locked, it's still 0. But as soon as we make our first keystroke, then record open count goes to 1. So as I typed that keystroke, a packet went from my client machine to the server and said, hey, I want to lock this record so I can start making changes to it. The server agreed. It reserved a lock for me and told me to go ahead. And now the server knows that this record is locked and it won't let anyone else modify it while I'm modifying it. And I can make various changes, and I can maybe set another field here, like they don't want me to ship it too soon. And then I could come in here and I could start changing some line items. And maybe I'm offering a better price, a lower price on the what's it item. And as I'm clicking through these records and making changes, the number of open records, each time I broke the barrier into a new record, the client had to go out and tell the server, hey, we want to lock this record to make changes to it, and it approved that request. And so now I have three records open. Now, if another client connected to this solution, then they would not be able to modify records that we're modifying. So I just spawned another copy of FileMaker. So this is going to simulate, well, it's not a simulation, this is a real, their client. And they're looking at the same order, and they can't see any of the changes that are in progress. This is a property of an atomic transaction because it hasn't been committed. You can't see any of the changes here. And if this user tries to make some changes, as soon as they start with keystrokes, they're going to get this notice that when their packet went to the server, said, hey, I'd like to lock this order to record to start making changes, it rejected and said, sorry, we already checked out this record to this other user. All right. I may have to come back. There's a question about hardening and security that I may have to come back to. It's a good one. All right, so what happens over here implicitly, users kind of get used to this idea if they've been using FileMaker for a while. You might give them a commit button on the layout, or they might learn that they can just click outside of a field. And as soon as they do that, it's triggering a commit. And so all of those pending edits that I was making got sent to the server, and the server checked in essentially my records and released those locks. And one of the features of FileMaker is that these refreshes sort of happen magically. The other client sees the changes without us having to run a script or anything like that. And this user could see that they screwed up the PO number or take out the stuff that doesn't apply. Now they can make changes, right? Because the record's no longer locked. The other thing, if your users, if you have some power users or you've trained them on this, they also have the opportunity, here we've got multiple open records. We've got 2 records that we're making changes to. And if we realize we're in the wrong place or none of this information we've been entering is correct, I don't want to keep it, they have the option to revert, which essentially abandons all those pending edits and notifies the server that these records can be unlocked. And so when we do that, this dialog box says revert all changes to this record. It'd probably be more appropriate if it said revert all changes to all pending record edits in the current window. That's maybe how, if we were going to be more precise about it. So there's multiple records here that are actually all going to be reverted when we approve that. So we drop back to 0, and it's as if nothing ever happened here, right? So that's sort of without any scripts involved. That's just the sort of atomic behavior of how FileMaker handles user entry into your records. All right. So I'm going to do something here where we explore a little bit of if we want to have more control over how those commits and reverts happen and maybe provide a better user experience. So most of your users are not going to learn about how to use the revert record menu command, or maybe even know that they can click outside of a field to commit a record. So we might want to provide ways to do that in a way that's more expected for them. So I'm going to go ahead and start creating another test order here and put in some information. Get some of these. All right. So we've started to set up my order. I'm on the phone with the customer and I'm ready to take down their information. And one of the problems that's come up in our system is that we keep finding incomplete customer records or empty customer records. And so we want to put some more control on how customer records are created in our system. So I have decided to use a card window for this. This is not a presentation on good user interface design. That's for someone else's presentation next time. This is more just roughed out layouts to sort of see how this stuff works. But I have a card here, and then I've presented the user with some options that they'd be familiar with, where they can either cancel editing the company information or they can save it. And we can make some, fill in some data in here and hit save, and it would be recorded. But if we realize we don't have everything we need yet to make this company record, maybe I need to go back and find an email or something, I can cancel. And I have not created an empty or garbage customer record. The entire thing was reverted. So let's look at what pieces I used to do that. There's lots of ways to approach this. So this is just one model to sort of make an example of this. So I created a layout called customer edit card, and I wanted to have it tied to the customer table occurrence. So it's going to be directly editing customers. So this is where we get to decouple from the order table occurrence and move to a different area in our relationship graph. And the other thing I've done is I've hooked up some triggers on here because I don't want people accidentally committing records or getting out of the card without my permission. So I put a trigger on record commit. And what I really wanted here is I wanted a feature that doesn't exist yet in FileMaker. I wanted a don't allow commits when calculation. And I wanted to put in a calculation that says don't allow them to commit the record and when this formula is true. So I have a little bit of a hack here that essentially accomplishes that feature. I want to control when they are allowed to commit, and I'm going to do it with a calculation. And the calculation is right here, is in the script parameter of the trigger. So basically I'm saying anytime the length of the script name is greater than 0, I want the record to commit. Otherwise, I want to prevent the commit from happening. And there's a very simple script that echoes back this calculation. It looks like this. Exit script, get script parameter. So this is just a yelling at the wall, and it echoes back at you. You send a script parameter in, it comes back as a script result. It's a one-line script. These lines down here are in case of emergency, break glass sort of thing. If you get stuck and you can't get out, you could use these to cheat. That's just for debugging. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of what we call type coercion, because in FileMaker, any non-zero number is considered true. So I can actually, I don't need greater than 0 in there. I can just say length get script name, and I'm going to coerce that number to a Boolean to decide if the record should be committed or not. And then I use the same trigger on layout exit, and this will keep them from being able to close the card window without it being supervised by a script. So this is sort of a crude limitation, but it's really just sort of saying anytime a script is running, go ahead and let records commit, go ahead and let windows close. But if there's no script running, if it's just the user wandering around with their mouse, clicking and typing, don't allow that to close or commit the record. And then I have a few scripts. I have a script for my order, my button right here. I have a script to handle when users click on that button. Then I have 3 little scripts to handle essentially opening the card window, another one for the cancel button, another one for the save button. So let's just go ahead and step through. Let's open the debugger and step through what this script does. So I've just clicked the button to create a new customer. I have a bunch of sort of boilerplate code and comments that are just part of a template. Anytime I start a new script, I just duplicate my template and kind of fill in the blank on some of these things. So this script doesn't have any parameters to it. It's just a button on the layout. And we'll get into the meat of the script here. I'm doing a little bit of defensive programming here. I really only tested this button on an order layout. So if someone copies this button to another layout and tries to use it again, I want that to fail. So I'm going to check that I'm on the right context that I was expecting. And then I'm going to try to determine, is this a situation where I'm editing a customer or creating a new one? So I can see the foreign key for my customer is empty. So I'm actually going to pre-generate the key for this customer record, even though the customer record doesn't exist yet. So this is something that you can't do with serial numbers, but you can do it with UUIDs. So I'm going to go ahead and create a UUID and store that in the foreign key. So this is a vision of the future. I will eventually have a customer record with this primary key. All right. And then I'm using a style of parameter passing called property list, but you could use JSON or any 6 fried rice or there's numerous options here. It's not too important as long as you use a consistent scheme for your parameters. So if we look at the parameter that I just composed here, it just looks like this. So here's the customer ID. Now the trick here that's special is that this customer ID doesn't actually exist yet. I created a primary key for a record that does not yet exist. And I also want to create a new record. So that was my second parameter. So then we're going to call another script that's still in the logic layer. This is the one that opens up the card and gets us ready to edit. So the first few lines here just decode those named script parameters into variables. And then we'll get into the meat of the script here. So I'm going to do some validation, make sure parameters are what I expected, just being defensive there. And then I'm going to go ahead and open a card. I decided to open it on an empty layout for now, but I could have opened it directly to the user interface layout, but I wanted to kind of make a decision about where I was going first. So there was no error opening the window, that's good. And then I am creating a new customer record. So now I'm going to go ahead and go to that, a layout that's tied to my customer table occurrence. This is some other record that just happened to be there. Make sure I'm in browse mode. I'm going to make a new record. So this is empty. Notice the primary key of the new customer record was automatically set by an auto enter. So it starts 46, 464, and then I'm going to step in. And because the customer ID was passed in, this 64D number, I'm going to go ahead and replace the primary key with this one that was pre-allocated. So now I've reassigned the primary key of the record, the draft record that I just made. And so the record is staged and I'm ready for them to start typing data in. So I might, just put my cursor in that field so it's ready for them. And that's it. So we're going to let that finish. So if we look right here, we have an open record. That is my draft customer record. And if I click outside the fields, it doesn't save. It still is open. If we open the debugger and see that if I try to click outside, that's going to trigger the on record commit. And here we can see that the length of the running script that was sent in as a parameter was 0, which prohibits the operation from completing. And this gives me a chance to do things like inside of my save script, I can have things like state as a required field. So I can do some friendly validation here. I also have options to put up warnings. I mean, this is all just because I have a script behind the save button. So this gives me a chance to inject sort of business logic. All right, so that went ahead and saved.
Chris?
Yeah.
A quick question for you.
Fire
So
away.
you've got your company records. When you create a new record, automatically generating a UUID, which you're going to replace.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason that you're having it automatically generate a UUID if you're just going to replace it?
Because other places in my system, I might not do it that way. I might have this is sort of the normal method would be for the auto enter to assign the primary key.
Mm-hmm.
And this was just sort of a outside of the box. In this situation, I wanted an external system told me ahead of time what ID that they wanted me to use.
Okay.
So I thought about not putting that in this demo, but it actually was going to make it hard. So I'm not sure if I have a good answer for that, but it's pretty rare that I do that, what we just saw where I replace the primary key.
Mhm.
But the only reason I pointed out is that that's legal if it's a UUIDs, because we don't have to worry about colliding with the serial number of some other record because UUIDs are always unique. So we can just pull one, out of our hat and use it whenever we want. And whether or not that gets on a record right away or a little bit later is okay.
Hey, Chris, I would actually go one step further and say you preemptively locked the order record. So you're synthesizing a transaction by doing so if you left it uncommitted.
Right. That's actually why I did this, is because I had two windows and I needed to have my order record and my card window both locked at the same time. So part of the trick there was assigning that foreign key and then also making a draft record. I don't want to get too much in the weeds on that though, because I think we could spend half an hour just talking about that. So, but I will make the demo file available and feel free to rip that stuff apart. There's lots, it's not the only way you could do that. All right, the only other thing I was going to show is sort of that trick of allowing the save to work. I'm going to change this to Washington State, and then when I click my save here, we can kind of step through and see. So I'm going to go through. This is where I did some validation to see if they filled in all the fields, if it was not in the continental US, some things like that. And then when I get down here to the commit, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So when this script tries to go ahead and save this record, that commit is going to run into that trigger. So we had that trigger defined on this layout. And so when the commit tries to happen, this trigger fires. If we did string length of this down here where it says customer save customer edit card, there would be 36 characters. So that's passed in as the parameter, which is yelled against the wall, 36, yell it as loud as you can, bounces off the wall, comes back from this, and 36 happens to be true because it is non-zero, and that allows the commit to proceed. Whereas it was not allowed to proceed when there was no script running because the parameter would have been 0. All right. The other thing that I wanted to touch on here really quick, I'm going to go make another record. And I'm going to do this one more time. So FileMaker has an internal record ID. And for this record, it's 12. So when you create a table in a FileMaker file, it starts out with no records, and this internal ID, starts at 1 and just counts up. So every time you make a new record, the number counts up. If you delete records, the numbers are not reused. The number just keeps incrementing higher and higher. And this is independent of if you even have a primary key on your record, because FileMaker has this internal tracking mechanism to keep track of records. So you might use UUIDs, you might use serial numbers, but these IDs always are there. You have to be careful how you use them because they're not very durable. If you export data and then import data from a backup, like if records were deleted and then you restore them from a backup and import them back into your table, they're going to have different internal record IDs. So that's why you import your primary key as part of your data, and that's going to be stored in a field. But these record IDs are sort of like a hidden field. Can't get rid of it. It's just always there. But I point that out because we just created a draft customer record, and it was assigned record number 12. And if we cancel, and then we make another customer record, now this draft record is record number 13. And we cancel, which is a revert. So essentially what's happening here is new record, and then revert. New record, revert, new record, revert. As this is happening, we're burning through those internal record IDs. So the point here is that whenever you say new record, FileMaker, it's sending a packet to the server. The server says, yep, you can have a new record. This is going to be your record ID. And it's yours to fill in and send us back when you're finished. And if you abandon that draft, you've still burned one of those internal record IDs. So it's kind of just helpful to understand that that sort of thing is happening under the hood, even if you're not using the record ID directly. All right, a couple of questions here in the chat. Let's see if I can answer these. All right, so the question was, could you, Barbara asked if you trap the commit or do you sometimes use globals? And I think the answer is yes, both. So in this case, I was I was using a draft record and I was letting the user type directly into the fields and then trap to prevent them from committing until I think they're ready. The other option is to create global fields and have the user do data entry into those globals, review the data, and then if it looks good, go ahead and send that to a new record. So wait to make the record until you've actually collected all the form data. I think it sort of just depends on what situation is the best fit for what you're doing. I've done it both ways. Sometimes it feels like it's less work to have to create 20 or 30 temporary data entry fields when I could just let the user enter data right onto the record itself, because I already have all the fields I need. So if I could use them for the data entry form, why not? But there are times when I would still use globals, and actually I will later in the demo. So, and then Vince asked, could you just run any script to trick my my hook on my trigger? And that answer is yes. Any script running would be trusted enough to commit the record. If I needed to be more precise with that, then I would make a more precise calculation on intercepting that commit. All right. So now we're going to level up and we're going to go down a layer, the user interface. So anyone that this is making, if 50% of what I'm talking about is making a little sense, you get a gold star. And then now we're going to try to make people's brains explode. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so I'm going to switch to another example, and this is a savings account or piggy jar or bank transaction, whatever you want to call it. I've created a table with accounts, and each account has a current balance. And so I've got a checking account, a savings account, and some savings funds. And I want to be able to move money between my accounts. And I don't want many of my money to disappear. So I want to use an atomic transaction here to make sure that if I'm taking money out of one account, that I'm very certain that it's going into another account of mine. And the other thing is I want to have some history about the transaction. So I want to be able to look back and sort of audit what happened. And so in this solution, we're going to see the history in a portal here. Should probably add some headings here, but basically there's a record indicating every time money came in or out of this account. So I'm going to attack this problem by making a script to handle transfers. And this problem is going to have some user interface that belongs in the presentation layer. But it also is going to have a reusable module for transferring money, because it's really important, and I want to implement it in the logic layer. And I also want to be able to reuse this business activity of transferring money. I want to be able to have other screens that I can trigger transfer from. Maybe I have a mobile interface that I can do transfers, or a web interface where I can do transfers. All of them should share the same business logic and should have the same kind of logging and integrity. All right, so I'm going to need a few things for this to work. So like was mentioned just a few minutes ago, could you use globals for data input? And that's what I'm doing going to do here. So in my user interface file, I've created a table for input fields. So I've got 3 globals in here. These are going to be for my data entry form so that people can tell me what account they want to take the money from and send it to and how much money they want to transfer. And right now that table doesn't actually even have any records in it, which will work for what I'm going to do. And then I also created a relationship down to my data file to show this list view here. And then I've got a relationship to the history, and that's how I had that portal open with the history records that came off just my relationship graph. And then there will be a script to handle this button right here. So there's going to be one script to handle the transfer. And then I want to perform the activity in my logic layer. So I've got my logic layer file here called Donner Wingman. Normally it's hidden, but I have it showing right now. And this file is constructed kind of like, there's no data in here. I have created this selector table, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then I create relationships from my logic layer down to my data storage layer, just like we did from the interface file. So there is some redundancy here in the graph. It's going to have some of the same relationship graph that my user interface file did, but not the same in that I only create table occurrences in here if I need them. So it's actually going to be a simpler graph in both files than if they were all in one, because we're only adding table occurrences as needed. So all the table occurrences that were needed for presenting the user interface don't necessarily have to exist in the logic layer. And then for performing the transaction, I'm going to want to have a handle on different records while I'm modifying them. And I'm going to use a selector approach for that. And I hope the guys that worked on selector connector and promoted that don't mind me borrowing that term, but I really like I think selector is a perfect term for this idea of using a foreign key to temporarily select a record, a related record that you want to work on. But I'm not using connector or anything like that. I'm just borrowing that one word from them. So we got another thing in the chat. Or in a card. So, okay. Yep. All right. So, and then I'm going to need a script in my Wingman file to actually perform the transfer. So I just have a script in here called transfer with history. So let's just run a demo without the debugger open and see what it looks like. Let me close all this stuff that I opened. So I'm going to do a transfer. Let's make this window a little bigger. I'm going to transfer from my checking account to my ski boat savings fund, and I'm going to put $2.25 in there. So I'll go ahead and do the transfer. And this opened because I'm in debug. I have a debug flag set. Normally that wouldn't open. And we can see that the money moved. Now I have more money in my ski boat savings, but my total value of all my accounts is unchanged. And I can also see the history of the transaction that I just put in there. I'm on Pacific time, so this is right for me. So let's step through and see how this works. So let me close a few things. We have less distractions. My other client. All right, so I'm going to transfer some more money from checking into ski boat. Let's do $1.25. And I'm going to go ahead and start that. So here we're in the in the interface layer still, and we're running a script to handle clicking on this button. And I decided not to pass any parameters to the script, but you might want to use parameters. That's fine. So the first thing I do is I don't want to get tangled. I've got another file, my logic layer file, that's going to be editing records, and I don't want to be entangled with any sort of edits that are happening in my window. So I'm going to commit just to make sure that there's nothing open over here that I might run into. And then while I'm still in the user interface layer, I'm going to do some form validation. I want to make sure that they completed, filled in all the fields that were needed before they clicked the button. So I can put up some errors if there's something wrong with the data they put in the form. And then I'm going to go ahead and assemble my script parameter. Let's look at that. So I have 3 parameters that I'm sending to my script: a source account, a destination account, and an amount of transfer. So that's all there is to that. And then I have a little switch in here to decide whether or not I want to run perform script on server. Right now I have a debug flag, so I'm running it locally so I can keep an eye on it. This is actually my preferred way of using perform script on server, is to just have a switch. So actually this little guy right here, whenever I set this global to 1, then all of my scripts run locally so that I can step through them. And if I turn that off, then this would run perform script on server instead. And I'm using the same script parameter for both, and the same decoding of the response, because it's really the same script. You could run it either way. All right, so now we've crossed the barrier down into the Wingman file, and this is a logic layer script. So this one is not going to have any interface. It's going to decode the script parameters. And for your sake, I'm using a debug layout. Normally, I would not be using a debug layout. We'll show that here in a second. So I'm going to go into the debug layout and make sure the window is showing. So what the main thing here is that I want to get onto a layout that's tied to my selector table occurrence. And then what I did here is I just took a screenshot of my relationship graph, and then I stacked a bunch of fields over the top, so you guys can kind of see what's happening under the hood as we step through the script. So this table has 1 record in it, which is important. And so I'm making sure I'm in browse mode, and then that the record is not omitted or something like that. And now I'm going to get into what we call the critical section of my transaction. This is the point of no return. This is that smallest atomic unit. We just crossed into that. So the first thing we want to do is work on our source bank account. So we're going to select the source bank account by setting the global field that's in our selector table. So we just set the key in here, and then we can see the related record through the relationship graph. So there's a check here that makes sure that there's 1 and only 1 record on the far side of this relationship. If this returned to 0, we would know that we were given a bad account number or something like that. So that passed. We didn't have any trouble finding the account number. The next thing I want to do is I want to lock the account record. So there is a script to step called open record, but that actually works on your current context, your anchor context. And I don't want to open the selector record. I want to open the financial account record. 11:05. I need to speed up just a little bit here. Okay, so so this step right here, what I'm doing is I'm clearing the modified timestamp. And mostly just because that's kind of a garbage field. When in a few moments, when I commit, that's going to be automatically filled back in. So it's a field that I can safely clear without causing any trouble. And when I did that, it locked the record. So I'm going to open my data viewer. We can see record open count just went to 1 because I have this record open. So there was no error locking the record. That's good. Now I'm ready to change the account value. So I'm going to decrease the value in my checking account. So it just dropped by $1.25. And the next thing I'm going to do is select the second account record. So the way I'm going to do this is probably the most important part of this whole concept. I'm going to change the key that's in my selector. And I'm just going to set that field in the selector table. So I've just put a new key in, and now I've selected my ski boat designated fund. And when I did this, I orphaned my checking account record. It still has a pending record edit. It hasn't been committed, but it's no longer in view. It's been detached from what I'm looking at. And I'm going to run the exact same sequence of events that I did on the first account. I'm going to make sure that there's one and only one account that matches my key. And I'm going to lock the record by clearing the modified timestamp. As soon as I do that, I can see I now have 2 records open that are pending. And there was no trouble with locking the record, so that's good. If there was, let's say someone else was doing a transaction on the ski boat account, I would have gotten back error 301, and I would have reverted this whole thing and walked away without causing any damage. I would cancel the script and throw away my pending edits. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the value of the financial account record. So now I've got $9.25 in my ski boat fund. And now I'm ready to make a log entry to track the activity on these accounts. So I'm going to use the create record via relationship feature of the relationship graph to create a record over here. So in this case, I actually want to make sure that this field is clear, that there's nothing in it. And when I have nothing selected here, what happens is if I set a field, any field on the child table occurrence, it's going to create a record for me. So as I cleared the modified timestamp, even though I set the empty string into modified timestamp, it still triggered the record to be created. It had an auto enter to set its primary key, and then FileMaker, some of us call this magic key. In order for this relationship to be valid, FileMaker backfilled that ID on that newly created record back onto my selector for me. So now I have 3 records open, and I'm ready to fill in all the log fields. So I'm just going to set some fields on there that belong in my log table. And I'm going to go ahead and capture the ID of the record I just created. So at this point, we are ready to save. If at any point we had run into any errors, we could just revert and nothing would have happened. But now we commit and we go back down to 0 records open. And now we are out of the critical section. So if there was any sort of like post-flight or follow-up activities we wanted to do that were not really an essential part of the transaction, we could go ahead and do that now. And then I'm just going to do some cleanup here. I'm going to switch my Wingman file back to the startup layout, and I'm going to clear these globals that I was using here just so that there's no trace left behind of what I was doing. And we'll move that out of the way, and we can see that we can already see the changed amounts in the user interface file. And then I'm going to clean up my user interface by closing the popover and clearing those data entry fields so that the next time I open the popover, there's nothing in there. All right. So that was kind of a lot. Let's see.
That was a card window, not a popover, correct?
Actually, there was there was no window.
Okay.
There's no window to see here. So let me, let's make that a little more clear. So I was using a debug layout so that you guys could see what was going on. That looked like this.
Right.
And that's just a bunch of fields stacked on top of a screen grab. But the normal layout that would have been used is this one right here. And this is a interfaceless layout. It's connected to a table occurrence, but there's nothing on it. There's a text element. There's no fields. There's no portals.
I was talking about the where the user enters the data.
Oh yes, this was a card window. Sorry, this was a popover
Oh, that was
with
popover. Okay.
with some global fields for doing data entry. Correct. All right. So what normally happens is I'm going to tell it to not use the demo layout. I'm going to switch that off. So now it's going to use this one that actually had no interface at all. And I'm going to go back here. And I'm going to turn off my debug mode. Close this. So now we can see we've got a single window open, just the user interface file, and I'll do a transfer. I've got some bills to pay. I'm gonna have to take some money back from my ski boat fund and put it in my checking account. So let's drain the ski boat. That's never gonna happen, and put it back in my checking account. And I should have closed my debugger. There we go. So now I've emptied my ski boat account. It's back up here. Everything refreshed. There was no window flash. There was no window that came forward. We're still just have a single window open. Now there are some hidden windows up here, but the user never sees those. And we use perform script on server for the transaction itself. So even if there was a lot of data being moved around or something as part of the transaction, we could do this over the WAN and it would be very fast. Now I'm going to do a quick proof that it actually is atomic. So I'm going to go in here from another user. I apologize for this getting a little long here. And I'm going to tie up the ski boat record. So I'm going to start making some changes here. So now I've got this account locked. And I'm going to try to do a transfer from, and this is something I didn't test ahead of time. So there's going to be egg on my face if it doesn't work. All right, let's try the transfer. Okay, error locking record. So this was a perform script on server script that tried to perform the transfer. It couldn't. It actually subtracted money out of my checking account. And then when it tried to put it into my ski boat account, it ran into a record lock. So it gave up, it reverted everything and sent an error message back to me. So the transfer never happened. It was safe. I can come over here. This other user can revert their activity. So they don't have any records locked. And now the transfer will go through. And they magically see the refresh, just like it would normally happen in FileMaker. All right, so how many questions? Let's see.
Chris,
Da-da-da-da.
Stephen had a question earlier about multi-tenancy.
Yeah.
So like if you had different, now you just showed multiple users, but what about like multiple operations in the same file? Like different departments, say, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Here in the multiple layer approach, I think if I was doing a multi-tenant solution where I needed strong, I mean, one option is to just add keys to your records, so what's the tenant ID? So every record has a tenant ID and you sort of try to keep them separate.
Okay.
But the other option would be in a layered approach, especially now that we have dynamic data sources, you could consider having multiple data tier files. And then as your solution is starting up, it could automatically route and open the correct data file for that tenant if you wanted to do something like that. So you could have some logic that decides, tenant A, B, or C, and then route to the correct data tier for that. And you could still use the same top level interface. And some other people who've done multi-tenant solutions they're already going down that path, and it would totally work with a multi-tier approach just as well.
Okay, thanks.
So I was going to just review a couple things here that we did. So we looked at the FileMaker internal record ID, and it gets allocated anytime you create a record, and it's not recovered if you revert. So if you create a record and revert, even though the record's never saved, we still do burn one of those internal IDs. We saw a magic key happen, and that's when you create a record on the far side of a relationship where the key had been empty, FileMaker automatically fills the key back in the left side from where I'm sitting. That's the left side.
Well, it will fill it both ways as needed.
Right.
It's like if you
That's
have
true.
if you have a multi-predicate relationship and you've got one field empty on one side and another field, key empty on the other side, it'll fill them both ways.
Right. So the other thing I was going to mention is you can use serial numbers, UUIDs, numeric UUIDs. Those can all work in the examples I showed. But there are some benefits of UUIDs in that they're less entangled with the schema. There's less locking and things that happen as compared to serial numbers. And we exploited that option to sort of flexibly pre-allocate a UUID and then assign it to the record later. So that might be beneficial in certain situations. As far as a practical limit, so when we were using that selector, we selected one bank account and then we detached from it and we selected another one without committing. There's nothing that would have kept us from selecting 20, 30, 40, 50 bank accounts. You should all go check to see if there's a penny missing from your bank account afterwards, because I might have collected all those in one transaction into my bank account. So that same model will work with any number of open records. If you're going across the WAN and you're performing this on the client side, I would probably consider how many records do I feel safe having open at once. But if I'm using perform script on server, I've tested with hundreds, thousands of records, all pending edit, and that's fine. It seems to work. It seems to work well. Probably the place I'd be most nervous is if you had really wide records, like if each of your records contains a huge amount of text and you're holding those all open, you might be accumulating quite a bit of data that needs to be committed. This idea of having a critical section in your transaction script where you sort of pre-flight as much as you can and post-flight things, and the effort here is to minimize the amount of time that you have records locked. So whenever you can, if it's a table that has a lot of activity from multiple concurrent users, you want to keep those records locked as short a period as possible. And that's another reason why you might want to use globals for doing data entry, because those don't tie up any record locks while people are doing data entry. So that might be to your advantage. And then this idea of the selector table is just a one record table on the left side that I use to select records on the right. And this is sort of an implementation trick, FileMaker. It's not user data. And so wherever you're using selector, that's where you define it. If you're using it in the logic layer, define the table there. If you're using it in the interface layer, define a table there. Maybe one in both. You might have a selector in your user interface file and another selector in your logic layer.
Chris, do you use that as like a session record?
I'll come back to that.
Okay.
That's a good question. So you can use it with existing records. So we selected a record, edited it, we orphaned it. You could reselect it and edit it some more if you want. That works with existing records. When you create records, because the server doesn't have a copy of the record yet, there's no way to reselect it. So this is sort of a gotcha. If you have data to fill in on a record and you start setting fields and you detach or orphan it, you can't get it back until after you commit. It's sort of in limbo. The other thing is that selector doesn't really work for deletion. You may need a temporary or session record for that, or use a portal element, which I would prefer to not put user interface elements in my logic layer if I can avoid it, but I might use portals if I had a situation where I needed to delete a group of records together. Also, this is a bug that a mistake that I often make. If I don't ever create a record in my selector table, it will block you from being able to create records. So if you're trying to create a record through the selector and it's failing, it might be because you don't have a selector record that exists yet. And then locking on your selector record can be a problem. So this is why you might want to use a session record. So if you have a selector like this, and you only have globals in that table, which is what I had, then we can do, when we go through the script and we set fields in these child tables, it only locks records in the child tables. The selector record is never locked. However,
Even if you had your cursor in a global field, that would not lock that record.
well, if I'm using the set field step, you're safe. As soon
Yeah.
as you have user interactivity on a layout that reaches through a selector, the mouse and keyboard is different. When a user clicks into a field and does the same action that you would have done with set field, it does lock the anchor. So this same exact graph and my demo layouts, if I had clicked in and typed in values, it would have locked the selector, whereas the script didn't lock the selector.
Isn't it true, Chris, that if you don't actually change something, just clicking into a field doesn't lock it?
Correct. The
Okay.
first keystroke, really.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there's been some questioning or debate about, well, what if I start having fields in my selector table or whatever you call it that are not globals? Does that trip things up? It actually doesn't necessarily change the behavior. It's the same. But if I used a foreign key over here that was not a global field, like if I forgot to check the box to mark this as a global, it would still work, but in doing so, it would cause the anchor to lock. So then as soon as I start changing, I start doing set fields in my account, it would trigger a lock on the selector table. And so the perfect recipe is don't have any user interface, nowhere for anyone to click. They can't type because there are no fields on the layout, and use the set field step. And in that scenario, and make sure your fields are all global. And in that case, the selector record will never lock. Yeah, this was so a couple of days ago, I was just getting ready to prepare my slides, and I came across this in a forum where people were talking about MySQL transactions. And the first comment was someone that literally said this, blah, 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 I've been doing this 20 years, I've never needed this kind of thing. That's fine. Yeah, you don't have to use this stuff. There's lots of solutions that don't use atomic transactions. But some of the aspects of it, checking for errors, reverting if things are going downhill, it's not that hard. I mean, when you start to get in the habit of it, you're kind of already doing it as a power user through the mouse and going down the menu and hitting revert, and just putting those into script steps is not that far away. it's going to leave less garbage in your system. You know, there's going to be fewer incomplete records or damaged missing data that you can never figure out how did this record get screwed up. It's a good chance that those are things that you might have been able to catch with transactions. And even if you're not doing transactions, there's all kinds of other things that can cause errors. So you likely need to be trapping for errors regardless. You know, errors when you try to open a new window can fail, or finding a record can fail, things like that. So you kind of need to get in the habit of checking for errors anyway. And even if your solution today only has 1 or 2 users and not a lot of records, if you build a good solution for this user of yours, they're going to be successful, and then they're going to become a bigger company, and then they're going to be more successful. And then sooner or later, you're going to realize that you've got 4 or 5 people trying to modify inventory at the same time. And having some of these things in place will become more important later on.
Chris,
Hey, Chris.
Tony, yeah, go ahead. Ask your question, Tony.
Okay, hey, Chris, you mentioned record ID, and I on your blog, Scale FM, you got some really good content on record ID. I'm a big fan of it here. 2 fields, calculation fields, one of them unstored, one of them stored. I dropped the question because I think this is really huge, bread and butter. I dropped the kind of a question. We have 3 fields going to every table: record ID twice, unstored once, stored the other time, and a list of, which targets the unstored. And we use it a lot for runtime features. So here's my question. That was all the setup. The question is it a heck of a lot faster? It seems like it'd automatically be faster than UUID because record IDs are shorter. And I would think it also might be faster because the record ID exists on deep level. Clay mentioned something called HBAN, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
All right.
If that question made sense.
Yeah. So in my template table, I have a bunch of those things you talked about. So this is the kind of like whenever I make a new script, I copy my template. That's how I get started. Whenever I need a new table, I copy my template table. In there, my preference right now is UUID, although I've started doing lowercase UUID sometimes. And I do have 2 additional unstored fields that I always include. The get record ID, which is just a way of peeking at that. Get record ID works fine in the data viewer, but it's always in your current context. So if you want to see the ID of a related record, it's handy to have it as a defined field. And by making it unstored, then there's nothing that's there's basically no cost, because this is an internal field that's already being sort of fetched whenever FileMaker is thinking about the record, and it can just evaluate the get function to retrieve that value. I'm generally not a fan of storing a copy of the record ID on the field just because of how volatile it is. Because there can be, not only can there be gaps in record IDs, but if you ever have a crash and you lose, 20 records at the end or whatever, and then you go, or some user accidentally deletes a bunch of records or does a bulk replace, and you've got to go restore data. When you restore, all the record IDs are now going to be different. And so that can become a very complex problem to try to realign all your related records.
I would, Chris, I think you're making a good caveat there, which is do not use this for a primary key, not for primary key use. That all said, for runtime use.
So are you talking about using it for like, hey, I just got back a set of records from perform script on server and I want to find them on the client sort of thing?
There's a sorting portals that don't suck, I think was the blog post name by Portland.
Yep.
And then there's some features that we've been building to get the fastest possible multi-select. And there's a variety of use cases that can leverage the ability to get a list of, I call it record pointers, but record
Right.
IDs. And
Yep.
final use case is if you're doing pair programming with someone and you're using UUIDs because you're having a distributed system or because you like them for everything, just to be able to be talking with someone on the other side of the phone call and say, hey, go to record 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as opposed to reading off a 16-character string. So,
Yep.
and then final thought, I was talking to Clay at a DevCon, and I'm not sure I understood everything that he was saying, but it does seem, as you've just said a moment ago, because it exists on a deep, 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 deep level, and it's already something that's being passed across the wire, it does seem to offer the potential of being the fastest possible way at runtime. Don't use it for a primary key, but at runtime.
Right.
And
Yeah,
your
I
blog post
think
has some really good content on it,
I'll make a pitch for if you search Scale FM and sequence generator, that was our answer to your problem of needing to read the ID to someone over the phone. So even if it's not pair programming, end users need to be able to talk to each other about customer account numbers or invoice numbers. So there are times when you need a human readable ID for things, and I would still use UUID for the primary key, and then I would use something like sequence generator and a script. So whenever I'm creating an invoice or creating a customer record, I would assign one of those human readable IDs if there's ever a chance that I need to talk about it with a human. And I agree that that's maybe not ideal for the programmer situation where you it's a short time problem where you need to talk about this while you're developing it. Record ID might be okay for that. But
and that's what we use, the stored one. And because it's in every table, like, by the way, the tool that you mentioned free on your website, I think you said earlier, is a really good thing for maintaining sequential invoice numbers, sequential purchase order numbers, et cetera. If you have a ton of tables, just just add a field, put it on a layout. But lots of ways to approach it. And
what keeps you from getting on the phone with them and just saying, can you go to the fourth record, in the unsorted set and talking about it that way?
If you give them that access.
Right. I guess in the scenario of a developer where you're on the phone with a developer and you want to talk about a record that you're troubleshooting or something.
Let's see.
I think I tend to talk about the fourth record in the table or something like that if I'm on the phone with another developer.
Well, just to be able to search, say, search for record 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, well, in this day and age of everybody on Zoom, having to read a number to somebody over the phone is becoming a lost art.
Yeah, and I definitely do use the list of. Most of my tables have a list of the primary key, and for me, that's almost always a long UUID, a whole bunch of UUIDs with line breaks, and that has scaled fine, and I haven't yet run into a situation where I need to return, 5,000 record IDs in a script result or something. At that point, I would maybe be looking for shorter, more dense alternatives, like a stored temporary record ID or something that maybe I only use it in a short time window and it's not something that's expected to be stable.
Yeah, it's a runtime use. It's absolutely positively doesn't work for primary keys, and it doesn't, as you said earlier, doesn't survive. There are, spoiler alert, I've got a restore found set technique using record IDs in a stack find, and it's just very generic. You can drop it into any system. But anyway, I think that's enough said on that. Your blog post, your website really does some terrific stuff about record ID and record number.
So you would use the record ID like any other piece of data that's not a key. It could change at any moment and you can't rely on it.
Well, it survives the session 100%. It only changes, it is, if you take the caveat seriously and, limit the caveat to what it applies to, don't use it for a primary key. You
Yeah.
know, but use it for other things. Use it for when you can, and not. It's lightweight. It's like JSON versus XML because it's very short. It's fast because it operates on a deep level, and it can be leveraged for multi-select. It can, you know, you can restore a found set, including the sort order. You can do all kinds of amazing things with it. Anyway, just shout out,
Yeah.
and it's fast because it's HBAN.
Yeah.
And I got nothing to say about transactions, but I'm enjoying the presentation.
Barbara's got her hand up and her virtual hand up, both.
Yes.
Go for it.
I just have to say, I am struck at how two people have reached the same thing. And that is how Todd, and I worked on the carbon project with him, is so similar to what you have. And yet you haven't been in the same room. We're talking about this. And also, I think
we've
the
talked
same
about
thing
it a
that's
few-
happening with hints. It's like the transaction groupies that are out there. So at some point, Chris, you and I need to sit down and go through carbon together because it's just a lot of this so similar thing. And I don't understand, and perhaps it's just semantics. He always refers to what we've put together as model view controller. And you have asserted that is not the same as a 3-tiered. And I went on Stack Overflow, and no one seems to have any agreement on all of that. So I'm just going to let that go. But yeah, it's just it's vindicated in a way that, you know, two separate people got to the same place, but a lot of similarities. And I have two things to say. If it's very simple once you have the structure in place to script this way. That I will champion that as well. And the second thing I will say is if you don't think you need to do this, you most certainly have data integrity issues you're not aware of. And I really strongly feel that way. So there you go. But yeah, I'm here a little bit just to constantly see this reflected back and just to see what other little trick I can pick up from some other people.
I think maybe one thing that would be different between model view controller and a presentation logic data model is that, and I didn't really mention it yet, but we have a strict downward reference policy. So
and I believe we do too. We never reach up to the UI from the logic layer, is what you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So in the logic layer, you're allowed to reach down to table storage or Wingman.
Yeah.
And in the Wingman layer, you're allowed to reach down to table storage, but you're never allowed to reach up.
Same thing.
And most of my understanding of model view controller is a little bit more of a triangle and less of a layer
So
cake.
that's why you make the distinction. Okay.
Where model view controller will sometimes there will be events or messages that are sort of sent, you know, to the three sides of the triangle. That's maybe the strongest distinction that I see. And sometimes we need that. And actually we get some of that happens sort of magically already. Like when you update a record in the data layer, it's pushed up to the presentation layer. People see the changes. So that's kind of a message coming from the data layer back up to the presentation layer, but it's FileMaker magic. I don't code that.
Yeah, but Chris, what would you consider, okay, to try to understand what you're saying? So if you have a UI script calling a controller script, and you're sending the result back up to the UI file from the controller. So
it's sort of it's a response to it. Well, it's an answer. It's not a
call.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a response to a call. Yeah.
So I don't know, it gets a little murky.
And it's and there are times when I want to break the rule. And it's usually when I have a big report and I want to have a progress indicator. So I
Yes.
want to send a message from my logic layer back to the presentation layer saying, let's tell the user that we're 50% done and this is going to take another 5 minutes.
Exactly. And
Okay.
other things that I often do, as much as we want all our business in the logic layer, which we call controller, I will do what I think I saw you do, which is some validations in the UI script. But I do that as belt and suspenders. I will still have those same validations in the controller script. Because as I've been taught, you might have an API talking to your logic layer. So you still need the validations in the controller from what you call what, wingman?
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, so interesting. It's the next level of this, I think. So we got to start people somewhere.
Yeah. Vince had a comment. Vince, would you explain your comment? Did he still there?
Hold on, let me check what my comment was. Hold
Either
on.
integrity issues or very, very slow. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things primarily that we use transactions for lately is to denormalize data so that, or store data actually, which I should say, and store data transactionally. So, so that, you know, the transaction happens successfully and the calculation is actually stored. So we reduce the number of unstored calcs, and that makes performance kind of, you know, depends on the complexity of the solution. It dramatically transforms the performance of the solution, especially over a WAN. So
yes, definitely. Or even just caching values, just so you can sort locally.
Yeah.
Rather than
So,
reaching out to a
what-
related field for the sort. Mhm.
So if people haven't denormalized, an example in this case would be like, down here, I have a summary field that's the total of all my accounts. And that works fine when I have 6 accounts. But if I had 5,000 or 10,000 accounts, then whenever I want to show the total value, FileMaker is going to have to retrieve all those records and send them up on the fly. It's an unstored, on-demand sort of event. And if I'm using transactions and I make a company policy that we're never going to change the value of an account except through a transactional script, then I give myself permission to make this a stored field, and I update the total value as part of any sort of transaction against my accounts. And then essentially I've denormalized because I have redundant, even though it's not the same number, I could arrive to my total account 2 different ways. I could sum these up or I could store it, and I'm kind of having redundant data, which we would call denormalizing. But then the advantage is I can load my account and see what my total, you know, of all my accounts is instantly, because it's 1 record to retrieve instead of 10,000 accounts. So yeah, that's definitely a time where transactions can be helpful, where you need to store something like that you need to be able to retrieve quickly over the WAN, but you need to be confident that it's still the correct total, which is hard to do if you aren't controlling the transaction and catching, you know, locked records and things like that.
Well,
Again, belt and suspenders, you could always have a server-side's cleanup script every night.
Right.
If,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, one of the
Please.
things that I've been moving towards lately is where does it take the least amount of effort to present a piece of data? Now, if like what you're talking about with the transactions, and I hadn't even thought about it on a transactional level, but you want to store stuff where it will take the least effort and the least amount of time. So what Barbara mentioned, the word caching a minute ago, that's what I call it most of the time, is where you would cache a number instead of having it calculate on the fly when you're presenting it. You know, you cache it ahead of time so that then it is available. And so what you're talking about is using transactions to do that. That makes perfect sense, and it's a logical next step for my approach.
Yeah, I think caching can work really well. I think whenever you use caching, then you're sort of forced to put a little asterisk on your layout that says, you know, total values are, you know, updated nightly or something, because if you're not using transaction, the real value and the cached value may drift apart until you
Well,
recalculate and cache again.
Usually
right?
I have it like on a record commit or record load or something like that,
Right.
where making one little calculation is not going to be noticeable to the user.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, and it's the issue I think is just once you cross a precipice and you start showing people cached data, then what you're showing them, you can only have so much confidence about until you get far enough along that you've decided that you're going to control all the activity on the underlying data and check for errors and do it as a transaction. And then you can be confident again that the number you're showing them is actually
Right.
precise, right?
Yes.
So there's a uncomfortable sort of middle ground where you can pick up some performance with caching, but you're not as confident about the number being 100% accurate until you go so far as to make a self-imposed policy about how you're going to edit those records to make sure that the total is never off from the parts.
Yeah, I was more referring to something like since we do party model a lot, you might have a person's name field 3 hops away in a relationship graph. So I would cache a customer name on the party roll record for customer, even though their name is actually stored all the way in the organization table. That's what I meant by caching.
Right.
And how do you handle when their name changes to update the cache? Is it a nightly thing?
It's a transaction.
It's a transaction. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
It's almost always a transaction.
Chris, I have another question, if I may.
Yeah.
So how much caching is FileMaker doing these days? Like, like in the last, I don't know, I guess 3 or 4 versions, they were caching, the script catalog, they were caching, the layout catalog, etc. Are they like caching the records themselves? I thought like when you open a solution and you haven't gone to the solution in a while, so you'll get your cache kind of installed. But if next day you come in again, you open it, you'll notice a dramatic difference in opening it. It's much faster. So can you speak to how much is being cached?
It is the records, and I cannot speak to how much. I can't speak to how much it's changing from one version to the next. I feel like it's not changing that much. Yeah, I'm not set up to show it quite here, but basically, sorry, I switched to a different user account on my Mac so that you wouldn't be seeing all my notifications and everything. And now I don't have all my tools; they're missing. But my understanding of how it works as an experimenter, right? I've poked the thing and poured some acid on it and stuff in it. What seems to be happening is that whenever you need to display a record or read a record for a calculation, the record is fetched on demand. So you've got a formula that reads some field, or you've got a layout that shows a field. As soon as everything in FileMaker, as much as possible, is lazy loaded, so it's on demand. As soon as I bring up my account list and I can see all 6 records, the client tells the server, I'm going to need these records. The server sends copies of them back across the wire, and they go into my cache, and they stay in my cache. And I can quit FileMaker and start FileMaker, and they're still in my cache. It persists quitting and launching. It came first to FileMaker Go and then later to FileMaker, but it's been in there for quite a while now. And then if the picture that I get is that if some other user, if I'm on another layout, and then some other user comes in here and changes a record, the impression I get is that the message that is sent from the server to the first client over here is, hey, your copy of this record is no longer good. Get rid of it. And it's discarded from the cache. But I do not fetch it again until I need it. So when I switch back, now it says, oh, I got to throw away that one that I was told I had a stale copy. I'm going to go ask the server for a new copy. So the data is accumulated as you access it. It's purged as the server notifies you that you have old versions that should be discarded. And it's not fetched again until you need it again. So in general, I think that that means, because most of us have a lot of records that don't change, that you accumulate a larger and larger record cache on your client machine, and it persists between launches and generally improves your performance, because there's and there's actually, if you run top call statistics, if you open a solution that has been closed for a week and you reopen it, there is a large amount of activity that goes on where the client is reconciling its list of records that it has in its cache with the records that are on the server to figure out which ones are need to be expired. And you can actually see that in the top call stats. There's a lot of data that transfers back and forth, and it seems proportional to how long has it been since you last connected and how much has data been changing on the server. So that actually can be slower than a cold start, because if you've been away for a month and then you come back and there's mountains of data that have changed and it's trying to reconcile all that, that can create actually some extra runtime, to start up until you close the solution and open it again 5 minutes later, and it's fast because you've already reconciled everything. Does that help or answer?
Yeah, no, that brings some insight I wasn't aware of. Thanks, Chris.
Cool.
There's definitely the other thing that's very interesting is how the prefetching works. So they've talked about how, like, if you're in a list or portal like this, when you bring it up, even though I can only see 3 records, it actually prefetches some additional records, so that when I scroll, it doesn't have, it's already prefetched the records and improves the scrolling performance. And my test seemed to indicate that it's proportional to how many records you can see. So it's actually like based on the geometry of, like, I can, based on my window size and the row height, I can see 3, so let's prefetch another 3 or something like that. So it's not a reliable, like you're always going to get X number of records. It seems like if you make your records really tall, it prefetches less. And if you make your records really short, it will prefetch more. There's some sort of secret sauce in there that changes how that works.
Cool, thanks.
Very good job, Chris. You've kept us all awake for 2 hours now.
Yeah, Chris?
That's a marvelous accomplishment. Yeah, Mike.
Yeah, just real quickly, I think we need to start a GoFundMe page for Chris so he can get that ski boat.
Well, it's going to take a while because I only have $1.12 right now. So.
Oh, well, I don't know if compound interest, stick it in a savings account.
Well, if I had bought 1.12 Bitcoin, 10 years ago, then yeah, I'd be buying the ski boat today, right?
Yeah, don't get me started on the $10,000 in Apple stock I had in the mid-90s. Oh man. Yeah, I would not be here today. I would be, owning my island in the Caribbean. So thank you very much, Chris. That was awesome. I did not get very much sleep last night, and I totally thought I would be nodding off here, and I totally did not. So that was fabulous. So anyway, thank you so much. We'll I have to run to another meeting, but
thanks
so
for organizing this.
well, we'll have you back definitely. And So we'll keep in touch on that. And Mike, when's your next meeting?
Let's take a look here real quickly. It's gonna probably be a pause debrief
Okay.
meeting, and it looks like it'll be October 12th, 6 p.m. Pacific time.
Okay. Mike has a group that meets like at midnight, where the rest of us are. No, it's like 9 o'clock in our time. You start at 6, right?
We start at 6.
Yeah, Eastern time. That's my bedtime. So anyway, so thank you everybody, and we'll catch you next month. If anybody did not get my notice about this meeting and would like to be put on our mailing list, send me a note back channel. And we'll see everybody in another 4 Thursdays. Thanks. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Yeah.
Chris. Thank you. Bye, Jonathan.